They know your shopping habits. They know what you buy, where you buy it, and how often you come back. And if your last name is on a list of 29 specific surnames, they know something else. They know you're probably Jewish. Not quote 0, not quote 1. 70 to 92% probability, and they're using that information right now. This isn't conspiracy. This isn't paranoia. This is demographic engineering, and it's happening in grocery stores, medical research labs, and artificial intelligence training facilities across the United States. A supermarket chain called Publix used this exact method to determine where to stock kosher chicken. They didn't survey customers. They didn't guess. They pulled up property records, cross-referenced surnames, and drew circles on a map. The kosher sections appeared in those neighborhoods within months. The sales data proved them right. The method is called DJN, Distinctive Jewish Names, 29 surnames that function as a nearly perfect sorting mechanism for one specific ethnic group. It was invented in 1942 by a researcher named Samuel Coase, refined over decades by demographer Ira Sheskin, and now it's in the hands of anyone with access to public records and basic statistical software. Corporations use it, algorithms use it, medical screeners use it to find Ashkenazi genetic disease carriers, AI engineers use it to parse training data, and the accuracy rate is terrifying in its precision. But here's what that list doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you about the 90% of Jewish people whose names aren't on it. It doesn't tell you about the Christians and atheists and Muslims whose ancestors bought a pretty German surname from a Habsburg bureaucrat in 1790. It doesn't tell you about the Soviet name changes, the Ellis Island translations, the forced conversions, the broken family lines, the maternal inheritances that vanish into paperwork. The list is a laser that only sees one narrow spectrum of light. Everything else is invisible, and yet your last name is still a code. It's embedded with geography, profession, religion, status, migration patterns, survival strategies, and trauma. The question is whether you can read it, whether you can separate the signal from the noise, whether you can trace the thread backward through 2 centuries of bureaucratic chaos, imperial border shifts, pogroms, assimilation campaigns, and deliberate erasure to find out what the name actually meant when it was first assigned to someone who had never needed a surname before. We're going to decode that system. We're going to show you how surnames became weapons of imperial control, how they became shields against persecution, how they became traps that followed families across continents. And we're going to give you the tools to determine whether your surname is evidence of anything at all, or just a coincidence that means nothing. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how the 29-name list works and why it fails. You'll know the 5 categories of Ashkenazi surname construction and which ones are genealogical dead ends. You'll know why the suffixes you think are Jewish aren't. You'll know where to find the archival records that matter and which DNA tests actually prove lineage versus which ones just sell you percentages. And you'll know the single biggest mistake people make when they try to trace Jewish ancestry through a name alone. One of those 29 names isn't what you think it is. We'll come back to that. But first, we need to understand how millions of people who had lived for centuries without surnames were forced to adopt them in less than 60 years, and how the people doing the forcing often had no idea what they were writing down. Before the late 1700s, most Ashkenazi Jews in Europe didn't have surnames. They had a first name and a patronymic: Isaac, son of Abraham; Rivka, daughter of Moses; Ben, Bat. That was the system. It worked fine inside small, tight communities where everyone knew everyone and communal records tracked lineage through oral tradition and synagogue registries. You didn't need a fixed family name because you weren't a legal individual in the eyes of the state. You were part of a collective, the kahila, the Jewish quarter, the shtetl. The empire didn't care what you called yourself, as long as you paid your taxes through the communal leadership. But empires grow. Bureaucracies metastasize. And by the late 18th century, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and Prussia had a problem. They had large Jewish populations they couldn't count, couldn't draft, and couldn't tax efficiently. The solution was simple: Force them onto the same naming system as everyone else. One surname per family, inherited patrilineally, fixed in stone. No more bend this or bat that. No more fluidity. You are now a data point in a ledger. Austria moved first. 1787. The Edict of Tolerance under Joseph II mandated that all Jews in Habsburg territories adopt permanent surnames. Not optional, not negotiable. You show up at the government office, the clerk writes down a name, you sign it or make your mark, and that name is now your family's legal identity forever. Refusal meant expulsion or worse. The Russian Empire followed in 1804, then again with harsher enforcement in 1844 under Nicholas I. Prussia rolled it out regionally throughout the early 19th century. France imposed it after the Revolution. By 1850, nearly every Jewish family in Central and Eastern Europe had been forcibly surnamified. The largest mass renaming in human history. Millions of people who had lived for 1,000 years without fixed family names were now locked into a system they had no hand in designing. And the people writing down those names? Clerks. Minor imperial bureaucrats who spoke German or Russian or Polish and usually had no knowledge of Hebrew or Yiddish. Sometimes the families could choose their own names. Sometimes they were assigned at random. Sometimes the clerk was bribable. Sometimes he was drunk. Sometimes he was anti-Semitic and gave you a name that meant pig or shit or thief because he thought it was funny. Sometimes he just transliterated what he heard and spelled it 5 different ways across 5 different documents. This is why you'll find the same family with 3 different surname spellings in 3 different census records. This is why brothers ended up with different last names because they registered in different districts. This is why your great-great-grandfather's surname might not match his father's surname even though there was no name change. The system was implemented at scale, at speed, by low-level functionaries who didn't care about consistency. What you have in your family tree isn't necessarily what was intended. It's what got written down on a particular day by a particular clerk who may or may not have been paying attention. But inside that chaos, there are patterns, because even arbitrary systems develop grammar. Even random assignments cluster around categories, and if you know the categories, you can start to reverse engineer intent. The first category is the easiest to identify. Status names. These are surnames that encode religious or communal roles that predated the surname system. Cohen, Cohen, Kagan, Katz, Kaplan. These all mean the same thing. Priest, descendant of the priestly class that served in the temple in Jerusalem before it was destroyed in 70 CE. The line is supposed to be unbroken, passed from father to son for 2,000 years. Genetically, there's some evidence this is partially true. Y chromosome studies have found a higher than random frequency of a specific genetic marker called the Cohen modal haplotype in men with these surnames. Not universal, not definitive, but statistically significant. Then you have Levi, Levin, Levitan, Levitt, Siegel, which is an acronym in Hebrew meaning __quote_5__. These are Levites, the assistant priests, also supposedly patrilineal, also trackable to some degree in genetic studies. Then you have rabbinic acronyms, surnames that are compressed versions of titles or family lineages. Marshak, Morinu Harav Shmuel Kaidanover. Our teacher, the rabbi, Samuel Kaidanover. Roshal, Rosh Lamed, head of 30. Sachs, Zerah Kodesh Shemo. His name is of holy seed. These names function as pedigree certificates. They say, this family produced religious scholars. This family had status. But here's the trap. These names were also sometimes assigned arbitrarily. A clerk who knew a little Hebrew might assign Katz to a family who claimed priestly descent, or to a family who didn't but seemed respectable enough. Or a family might adopt, quote, 7 aspirationally as a way to claim a status they didn't have. By the 20th century, there were Cohens who had no genetic link to the ancient priesthood, and Levites whose families had been bakers for 8 generations. The name might be real. It might be a bureaucratic fiction. You can't know without corroborating evidence. The second category is toponymic, place names, surnames derived from the towns and cities where families lived or originated before the surname system. These are some of the most common Ashkenazi names, and they're also some of the most misleading. Warszawski, 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 from Warsaw. Epstein, from Epstein, a town near Frankfurt. Shapiro, from Speyer, a city in the Rhineland. Brodsky, from Brody, a town in Galicia. Gordon, possibly from Grodno, possibly from Gordon in Scotland, possibly from elsewhere. Berlin, Berliner. Posner, from Posen. Landau, Krakauer. Minsky, Pinsky. Lublin, Lvov. The map of Jewish migration written into family names. These names tell you where a family was at a specific moment in time, usually the moment when they were forced to adopt a surname. But they don't tell you where the family originated, they don't tell you how long they stayed, and they definitely don't tell you if they were the only family in that town with that name. In many cases, dozens of unrelated families from the same town were assigned the same surname. So if you meet two people named Shapiro, they might share an ancestor. Or they might just share a clerk who wrote down __quote _8 _ twice. And here's the bigger problem. Toponymic surnames are not ethnically distinctive. Germans have them, Poles have them, Russians have them, Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, everyone. A surname that ends in Sky or Berg or Stein might point to Jewish ancestry. It might also point to Slavic or German ancestry. The suffix tells you linguistic origin, not religious identity. You need context. The third category is occupational, surnames based on trades, professions, and economic roles. This is where the bilingualism of Ashkenazi life becomes visible, because these names exist in two linguistic layers, Hebrew and Yiddish on one side, German, Polish, Russian on the other. Schneider, tailor. Portnoy, also tailor but from Yiddish. Melamed, teacher from Hebrew. Shkolnik, teacher from Yiddish. Kayat, tailor again from Hebrew this time. Feldman, field worker. Kaufman, merchant. Kramer, shopkeeper. Fishman, glazer. Becker, baker. Fleischer, butcher. Sandler, shoemaker. Sapozhnikov, also shoemaker but Russian. Some of these are straightforward. If your ancestor was a tailor and the clerk wrote down Schneider, that's probably what happened. But many occupational surnames were assigned generically. A clerk sees a Jewish family, knows Jews are often in trade, writes down __quote _13 without asking. Or the family picks an occupational name because it sounds respectable, even though they've never worked in that trade. By the mid-19th century, occupational surnames had become conventional rather than descriptive. The name says shoemaker. The family has been selling grain for 4 generations. And then you run into the linguistic traps. Becker, Fleischer, Schneider, Kaufmann, these are all German words. They're common Jewish surnames. They're also common German Christian surnames. The phonology doesn't tell you anything. You need archival proof. The fourth category is patronymic and matronymic, surnames derived from given names. This is the most widespread category and also the most confusing because it overlaps with non-Jewish naming traditions across Europe. Davidovich, son of David. Abramson, son of Abraham. Jacobson, Moseson. Isaacson. Rivkin, from Rivka. Sorkin, from Sarah. Perlman, from Pearl. These names do exactly what the old patronymic system did, but they freeze it. Your great-great-great-grandfather was Isaac, so now everyone in your line is Isaacson forever, even if nobody's been named Isaac since. But here's the overlap problem. Scandinavians use the same system. Swedes, Norwegians, Danes. Patronymics frozen into surnames. Johnson, Anderson, Eriksson. Same structure, different ethnic group. Russians do it too. Ivanov, Petrov, Sidorov. So a name like __quote _15 might be Jewish. It might also be Scandinavian if the root name was __quote _16 in Swedish. You need documentary evidence to know which. And matronymics are even stranger. Most European naming systems are patrilineal. but Ashkenazi Jews sometimes used the mother's name, especially if she was the more prominent figure in the family or if the father had died. So you get Rivkin from Rivka, Sorkin from Sarah, Baskin from Basia, Perlman, Zucker's wife. These names embed a matrilineal memory into a patrilineal system. They're anomalies, and because they're anomalies, they're often misread as something else entirely. Now we get to the fifth category, the one everyone thinks is definitive: ornamental surnames. Artificial names built from German roots, usually combinations of precious metals, gemstones, plants, animals, and natural features. This is the category that people stereotype as Jewish names, and it's the category where the stereotypes break down hardest. Goldstein, Gold Stone, Goldberg, Gold Mountain, Rosenberg, Rose Mountain, Rosenthal, Rose Valley, Blumenthal, Flower Valley, Blumenfeld, Flower Field, Greenbaum, Green Tree, Weinberg, Wine Mountain, Edelstein, Noble Stone, Silberstein, Silverstone, Morgenstern, Morning Star, Himmelfarb, Heaven Color. These names sound poetic because they were meant to. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when Jews in German-speaking territories were being forced to adopt surnames, many families were allowed to choose their own names if they could pay a fee. Wealthier families paid more for prettier names. The more expensive the name, the better it sounded. Gold and silver and roses and stars. Poor families got stuck with whatever the clerk assigned, which was often crude or demeaning, so ornamental surnames became class markers. A name like underscore underscore quote underscore 18 underscore underscore didn't mean your family worked with gold. It meant your family could afford to buy a name that sounded valuable. The name was the product, and because it was a product, it spread. Other families adopted similar names. The fashion caught on. By the mid-19th century, ornamental German surnames had become conventional among Ashkenazi Jews in Central Europe. But then non-Jews started using them too, because these are just German words: mountains and flowers and colors and metals. Germans built toponymic surnames from the same roots. A Christian family living near a mountain covered in roses might be called Rosenberg for geographic reasons. A Christian family living in a valley full of flowers might be Blumenthal. Same words, same structures, different origins. And this is the trap that catches everyone. People see Goldberg and assume Jewish. People see Rosenthal and assume Jewish. People see any name with Steen or Berg or Baum or Feld and make the leap. But those are just German suffixes. Steen means stone. Berg means mountain. Baum means tree. Feld means field. They appear in thousands of German place names and occupational names that have nothing to do with Jewish ancestry. Frankenstein, Castle of the Franks, Liechtenstein, Light Stone. Beethoven, which admittedly doesn't fit the pattern but proves the point that German names are complicated. These are not Jewish names. They're German names that happen to use the same morphology. So how do you tell the difference? You can't. Not from the name alone. You need context. You need to know where the family was when the name was adopted, what language they spoke, what records exist. The suffix is not evidence. It's a hypothesis. And then there's the Sephardic branch, which destroys the entire framework. Because Sephardic Jews didn't go through the same forced surname process, they adopted surnames earlier, under different systems, in different languages, and the results look nothing like Ashkenazi names. Toledano, from Toledo. Perez, son of Pero, a common Iberian given name. Cohen, yes, but also Levi, which crosses both traditions. Azulay, from Arabic. Ohana, Benzaken, Benveniste, Abravanel. These are Iberian and North African and Middle Eastern names. They follow Spanish and Portuguese and Arabic morphology. They don't have underscore underscore quote underscore 25 underscore underscore or underscore underscore quote underscore 26 underscore underscore or any of the German markers. And yet, they're Jewish. Fully, documentably, unambiguously Jewish. So the 29-name DJN list that corporations use to identify Jewish customers, it's Ashkenazi only. It doesn't catch Sephardic names. It doesn't catch Mizrahi names. It doesn't catch Bukharian or Mountain or Ethiopian Jewish names. It catches one subset of one branch of one diaspora in one linguistic zone during one historical window. Everyone else is invisible to the algorithm. And even within the Ashkenazi subset, the list is full of holes because of assimilation, because of name changes, because of state-imposed Russification and Polonization and Anglicization and Germanization, because of the Soviet campaigns. This is the part that doesn't make it into the demographic studies. In the 1920s and 30s, tens of thousands of Jews in the Soviet Union changed their surnames, sometimes voluntarily, as part of assimilation into the new socialist order, sometimes under pressure to avoid workplace discrimination or university quotas, sometimes because the state mandated it. A name like underscore underscore quote underscore 27 underscore underscore became underscore underscore quote underscore 28 underscore underscore, which is just the Russian translation. Same meaning, different language. Blumenthal became underscore underscore quote underscore 29 underscore underscore Flower Valley, but now it's Slavic. Portnoy became Portnov. The semantic content stayed the same. The ethnic marker vanished. A Russian reading Zolotarev would see a normal Russian surname. A German reading Goldstein would see a Jewish surname. Same family, same ancestry, different legibility depending on who's reading. And then there's the Anglo-American layer. Ellis Island is a myth, mostly. The story that immigration officers randomly changed people's names is false. What actually happened is that names were transliterated from Cyrillic or Hebrew or Yiddish script into Latin alphabet, often by the immigrants themselves, and the results were inconsistent. A family named underscore underscore quote underscore 33 underscore 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 in Yiddish might become underscore underscore quote underscore 34 underscore underscore in English. Underscore underscore quote underscore 35 underscore underscore might become underscore underscore quote underscore 36 underscore underscore or underscore underscore quote underscore 37 underscore underscore or underscore underscore quote underscore 38 underscore underscore, depending on who filled out the form. But deliberate name changes happened too. In the early 20th century, many Jewish immigrants anglicized their names to avoid discrimination. Goldstein became Goldstone or Stone. Greenberg became Green. Kaplan became Kaplan, but then the son changed it to Copeland. Levy became Lee. Abramson became Adams. These weren't clerical errors. They were survival strategies. And then you have adoptions. A Jewish child adopted by a Christian family takes the Christian surname. The biological lineage is severed in the records. The genetic ancestry remains, but the paper trail ends. Or the reverse. A Christian child adopted by a Jewish family. Same problem, opposite direction. Or maternal lines. Your great-grandmother was Jewish. She married a non-Jewish man. She took his surname. Her children took his surname. Her children's children took his surname. 3 generations later, there is no Jewish surname anywhere in your direct line, but genetically, you're 25% Ashkenazi. The name tells you nothing. So when someone tells you that 70 to 92% of people with the 29 DJN surnames are Jewish, believe them. The statistics are solid. But understand what that number means. It means that if you sample a large population and filter for those 29 names, most of them will self-identify as Jewish. It does not mean that most Jewish people have those names. It does not mean that everyone with those names is Jewish. And it definitely does not mean that people without those names aren't Jewish. The list is a filter, not a map. It finds a subset. It misses the majority. So, what do you do if you want to know whether your surname indicates Jewish ancestry? You stop treating the surname as evidence and start treating it as a lead, a hypothesis, a reason to go looking for documents. First step, family archives. Start with what you have in your house: birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, immigration papers, naturalization records, military discharge papers, old passports, anything with an official stamp. Look for the quote 39 or quote 40 field. In Soviet-era documents, this is literal. The passport lists quote 41 as a nationality, separate from citizenship. In pre-Soviet Russian Empire documents, look for quote 42 or quote 43 . In Polish and German records, look for quote 44 or quote 45 . In American records, the ethnicity field is often blank, but immigration papers sometimes list country of origin and language spoken. Check the names of parents and grandparents. Check their birthplaces. Check whether they were married in a synagogue. The ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract, is direct evidence. If you have one, you have proof. If you don't have family documents, move to state archives. Vital records. These are birth, marriage, and death records maintained by governments. In Europe, these records often include religious affiliation because the state recognized religious communities as administrative units. Jews were registered separately from Christians. So if you find your great-grandfather's birth record in a Polish archive and it's in the Jewish register, you have proof. In the United States, vital records usually don't include religion, but they do include parents' names and birthplaces. And if those birthplaces are in Eastern Europe and the parents' names are Isaac and Rivka, you have a strong indicator. Then there are metrical books. These are synagogue records, births, marriages, deaths recorded by the Jewish community. They exist for most major Jewish communities in Europe from the late 18th century onward. Some are still held by synagogues. Many were confiscated by governments and are now in state archives. Some were destroyed in pogroms or during the Holocaust. Some survived and have been digitized. Jewish Gen is the largest database. It's a volunteer-run genealogy project with millions of records from Eastern European Jewish communities. You can search by surname, by town, by region. If your family is in there, you'll find records: birth records, marriage records, cemetery records, immigration records, Holocaust records. Yad Vashem has the central database of Shoah victims' names. If your relatives were killed in the Holocaust, they might be listed. The database includes testimony from survivors, deportation lists, ghetto records, concentration camp records. It's searchable by name. The JDC archives hold records from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which provided aid to Jewish communities in Europe and around the world from 1914 onward. If your family received aid, there might be a file. YIVO has the archives of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which collected documents from Eastern European Jewish communities before and after the Holocaust. Letters, photographs, community records, Yiddish newspapers. And then there are national archives. The Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg, the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, the YIVO Archives in New York, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Archives in Washington, the International Tracing Service in Germany. Each of these holds millions of documents. Some are digitized, some require in-person research, but the records exist. And if the documentary trail runs cold, there's genetic genealogy, DNA testing. This is not a replacement for archival research. It's a supplement, a way to confirm or rule out hypotheses. There are 3 types of DNA tests that matter for ancestry. Autosomal DNA, which tests all your chromosomes and gives you an ethnicity estimate. Y chromosome DNA, which traces the direct paternal line. And mitochondrial DNA, which traces the direct maternal line. Autosomal DNA is what companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe use. You spit in a tube, they sequence your genome, they compare it to reference populations, and they tell you your ethnic breakdown. The results come back as percentages: 40% Eastern European, 25% Ashkenazi Jewish, 15% Scandinavian, whatever. The Ashkenazi Jewish category is real. It's genetically identifiable because Ashkenazi Jews were, for centuries, a relatively isolated population. Endogamy was the norm. Jews married other Jews. The genetic pool became distinct, not unique, not pure, but distinct enough that modern algorithms can detect it with high accuracy. If your autosomal test comes back with a significant Ashkenazi percentage, that's strong evidence of Jewish ancestry, not proof, evidence, because the algorithms aren't perfect, and the reference populations aren't comprehensive, and there are edge cases and statistical noise. But if it says 25% Ashkenazi, and your surname is Goldstein, and your family came from Poland, the pieces fit. If it says 0% Ashkenazi and your surname is Goldstein and your family came from Poland, that's also useful information. It means either the surname was adopted under false pretenses, or there was a break in the line somewhere, or the family assimilated completely and the Jewish ancestry is so far back that it's no longer detectable in autosomal DNA. Y chromosome testing is more specific. It traces the direct paternal line, your father's 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 father, back as far as the markers go. If you're male and you test your Y chromosome, you can compare it to databases of known Jewish lineages, specifically the Cohen modal haplotype. If your surname is Cohen or Katz or Kagan and your Y chromosome matches the Cohen haplotype, that's strong evidence that the surname is genuine and that your paternal line does descend from the ancient priesthood. If your surname is Cohen and your Y chromosome doesn't match, that tells you the surname was either adopted arbitrarily or there was a break in the patrilineal line. Adoption, illegitimacy, name change, something. The genetic line doesn't match the paper trail. Mitochondrial DNA is the same thing, but for the maternal line. Your mother's 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 mother. It's less commonly used for Jewish genealogy because Ashkenazi Jewish identity was traditionally patrilineal. But it can still be useful, especially if you're trying to trace a specific maternal ancestor. The important thing to understand is that DNA doesn't replace documents, it complements them. If you find a birth record that says your great-grandfather was Jewish and your DNA test says you're 25% Ashkenazi, those two pieces of evidence reinforce each other. If you find a birth record that says your great-grandfather was Jewish, but your DNA test says 0% Ashkenazi, you have a puzzle to solve. Either the record is wrong, or the DNA test is wrong, or there's something in the family history you don't know yet. And DNA won't help you with legal claims. If you're trying to apply for Israeli citizenship under the law of return, DNA evidence is not accepted. You need documents, birth certificates, marriage certificates, synagogue records, something that proves Jewish ancestry through a recognized paper trail. The genetic evidence might point you in the right direction, but it won't satisfy a consulate. So the protocol is this. Start with the surname. Use it as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Research the etymology. Figure out which category it falls into: status, toponymic, occupational, patronymic, ornamental. That tells you what kind of evidence to look for. Then gather documents. Family papers first, state archives second, Jewish community archives third. Cast a wide net. A single record can open up an entire branch. Then test your DNA if you want confirmation. Autosomal for broad ethnicity. Y chromosome if you're male and you want to trace the paternal line. Mitochondrial if you're tracing a maternal line. Then cross-reference everything: the surname, the documents, the DNA, the family stories. Look for convergence. If all the evidence points in the same direction, you have your answer. If the evidence contradicts itself, you have more research to do. And accept that sometimes the answer is, I don't know. Sometimes the records were destroyed. Sometimes the family lied. Sometimes the bureaucracy was so chaotic that the paper trail is unrecoverable. Sometimes the genetic signal is too faint to read. Sometimes the surname is a dead end. That's the reality of genealogy. You follow the evidence as far as it goes. You don't invent what isn't there. You don't assume what you can't prove. And you remember that a surname is not a verdict. It's a clue. One piece of a puzzle that might take years to assemble. The 29 names on the DJN list are useful for demographers and marketers because they work at scale. They let you draw conclusions about populations, but they don't work for individuals. Your name might be on the list, and you might have 0 Jewish ancestry. Your name might not be on the list, and your entire family tree might be documented in synagogue records going back 300 years. The name is not the answer. The name is the question, and the only way to answer it is to do the work. Read the records, test the DNA, trace the migration routes, map the name changes, follow the broken lines, reconstruct what was lost. Because what you're really asking when you ask, "Is my surname Jewish?" is a bigger question. You're asking, quote, 48. You're asking, "Where did I come from?" You're asking, quote, 50. And the answer to that question is never simple. It's never just a surname. It's a knot of history and language and genetics and bureaucracy and survival and loss. You pull one thread and 10 more appear. You solve one mystery and 3 more open up. That's what genealogy is. It's not a single revelation. It's a process, an archaeology of identity. And your surname is the first artifact you dig up. What you do with it after that is up to you.